This afternoon, I'm going to share with you our last book about George Washington, and it's a nonfiction book called George Washington's Mother by Jean Fritz. Yes, George Washington's mother. It's about his mom. And there on the cover, I can see, I think that must be George Washington's mom fishing with her son. How fun. And I'll go ahead and read the blurb on the back of the book. George Washington's mother. Everyone has a mother, even George Washington. But Mary Washington is nothing like you'd think. She hates to dress up, and she always thinks she knows what's best for George. After all, she's his mother. You can read more about her in this true story by Jean Fritz. And there's a picture of maybe little George on the back, maybe eating some kind of baked item or little bread that the mom made, maybe. Okay, here we go. And this is by Jean Fritz, illustrated by DyAnne SiSalvo-Ryan. George Washington's mother. Oh, so on the title page, I notice a few things. Oh, well, over here, there's that bread again. I wonder if she liked to bake bread or something, because here's this bread again with red, white, and blue stars all around. And look, this is a very funny joke. So we've talked about this in class. There's a big famous mountain out in the state of South Dakota called Mount Rushmore. And it's kind of like a memorial to 4 of our U.S. presidents. The faces of 4 presidents are carved on the side of this mountain. And the 4 presidents that are there are Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. And we've studied about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Maybe later we'll be studying about Jefferson. But this is as a kind of a joke. Instead of Washington's face on the mountain, they show a picture of his mother, Mary. Isn't that funny? Okay, here we go. So there I see a young woman sitting in a chair looking out the window, and she's got a bunch of stuff on her lap, maybe like some plates or dishes. And here I see 2 portraits, Mary Montague and Colonel Joseph Ball. Oh, I wonder if those are portraits of her parents. Let's see. Everyone has a mother, even George Washington. Of course, she hadn't always been his mother. Once she was just Mary Ball, a pretty girl from Virginia, pretty as a rose. That's what people said. She had a sweet voice, and she was not poor. Her parents had died and left her some land and 2 horses. Also 2 gold rings, furniture, plates, a tablecloth, and napkins. Okay, and oh, look, they have like a black ribbon. That's to show, I guess, about when her parents died, and then these are the things that she got. And so there's some details about what she got. There's her plates, there's gold rings on the plates. I guess she's looking out the window at the 2 horses. She was born in 1708. 1708. I'm making a connection to Jamestown that was settled in 1608, 100 years before that. Okay, so she was born in 1708 when Virginia was an English colony. By the time that she was 21 years old, Mary still wasn't married. Her friends married at 16 or 17 or 18, but not Mary. Why? Maybe no one suited her. Maybe no one asked. In any case, Mary had a mind of her own. So remember, we talked about how a lot of things are different in the old days than they were now. And one thing that was different was that lots of girls and women married a lot younger. So when she wasn't married at 21, all her friends were already married. Then one day when she was 22, along came Augustine Washington. He was tall and strong. He looked as if he could take good care of her. He was 37 years old and had taken care of one wife for years. She was dead now, and he was looking for another wife. He already had 2 big boys, but they'd be no trouble. They were going to school in England soon. And there's a picture of her looking at him, and she's got a little think bubble that says, good teeth. I'm making a connection to George Washington's bad teeth, but this is going to be George Washington's parents. And again, I just want to point out, nowadays we know that Girls and boys can all do all kinds of different things in life. You have the choice of what you want to study in school, and all the different jobs that you would like to do are there for you to try to do if you can. But in the old days, we've talked about it was a little different, and men and women were kind of limited just to do certain things. So he asked Mary to marry him, and she said she wouldn't mind. Mary and Augustine were married on March 17th, 1731. George was born on February 22nd, 1732. He didn't look special. He didn't look as if he would become the father of his country. All people said was that he looked like his ma. A year later, Betty arrived. She looked exactly like George. Then Samuel came, and John, and Charles. Okay, so here are all the kids in a row. There's a speech bubble. I'm George, and there's the baby. Goo, making a baby sound. When George was 7 years old, the family moved to Ferry Farm across the river from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Ferry Farm suited Mary Washington just fine. For one thing, she loved the well. A well is a hole dug in the ground that you can get water from. She had never tasted better drinking water. For another thing, nobody else lived nearby. With no neighbors around, Mary would not have to dress up every afternoon. Mary hated to dress up. She could wear her old gardening clothes all day. Who would care? If she had callers are people who visit you, maybe she would dress up, maybe she wouldn't. But of course, she would serve her gingerbread. Everyone raved about Mary Washington's gingerbread. She always cut off the crusty end piece. This was called the kissing piece. Nobody ate that. Then she sliced up the rest and passed it around, and around, and around. Oh, so that's the special little picture of the bread we keep seeing. She was famous for her gingerbread. And it also sounds like she didn't like to have to get dressed up. In the old days, people would dress up when they were having a visitor instead of just wearing their old house clothes or gardening clothes. These were happy years at Ferry Farm. The children were still small. She could keep track of them. She liked that. And Augustine took care of the farm. Then, in 1743, Augustine died. Of course, he couldn't help dying, but who was going to take care of things now? Augustine owned land all over Virginia. What would happen to that? Mary was not pleased with what happened. Most of the land went to Augustine's boys by his first wife. Much less went to Mary's boys. Right away, Mary began to feel poor. Sorry about that. That's my cat wants to go out. I'll be right back with you. Sorry for that interruption. Our cats are trained to ring a little bell when they want to go outside. Okay, here we go. Mary had no reason to feel poor. Ferry Farm would belong to George when he was 21. She and her family could go on living there. The farm had 9 cows, 9 other cattle, 11 sheep, 19 hogs, 2 horses, and there were 20 slaves to work the place. She would never go hungry. Still, Mary grumbled and worried. George was the man of the house now, but he was only 11 years old. Why shouldn't her stepsons help? They had all that land. They were living in style. So Mary sent George first to August and then to Lawrence. Those are his 2 stepbrothers. Lawrence was George's favorite brother. He had fine friends, gave fine parties, and lived in a fine home. He called it Mount Vernon. Oh, I'm remembering that from our other learning about George Washington. When George was 14, Mary thought he should come back to Ferry Farm to stay. But George was like his mother. He had a mind of his own, and he wanted to go to sea, join the Navy. Mary had never heard such foolishness. The sea was not a safe place, and how could George take care of her at sea? Lawrence begged Mary to let George go. Mary said no. Lawrence argued. For 1 year, he argued. Mary still said no, no, no. Then she said, maybe. She wrote a letter to her brother Joseph in England. He would know what to do. He knew everything. She wrote, but she didn't hear, and she didn't hear. So at last, Mary gave in. So there George is riding off around Mount Vernon, and there Mary is thinking about how dangerous it would be for George at sea, but George is just thinking about how fun it will be to be at sea and having adventures. George packed his trunk and was ready to leave, but just then a letter arrived from Uncle Joseph. George would be crazy to go to sea. He said sailors were treated like dogs. So that was that. Mary told George to unpack his trunk. What could George do? Nothing. She was his mother, and he wasn't 21 yet. So there he is packing, and the dog is thinking, "Arf!" And there poor George is just tossing out all the stuff from his trunk because he can't go. Still, Mary found it hard to keep that boy on the farm. He traveled all over with Lawrence and his friends. In August 1752, Lawrence died. A few months later, Lawrence's wife remarried, and George became master of Mount Vernon. Now he'd surely stay put, Mary thought. He wouldn't be as close, but he could still take care of her. Then George joined the army. He became an officer in the Virginia Volunteers. He wore a fancy uniform. He learned to use a sword, and he drilled. He didn't go anywhere, so Mary didn't mind. Oh, and there she is, sitting in her nice chair doing some embroidery. And maybe George is a little proud of his uniform. And she's saying, "Very nice, dear." I'm actually remembering this is from one of the portraits that we've seen in another book of George Washington. But in 1753, the governor asked George to go west to the Ohio River. The French and English were arguing about land. There might be a battle, the governor said. This time George didn't ask his mother. He was 21 years old now. He just went. When Mary heard, she grumbled. Why was George meddling with the French? She asked. They were none of his business. She was his business. Suppose she ran out of money. Right away she felt poor. Well, George did fight. He didn't win, but he came home safe. At least that's what the paper said. But Mary didn't trust the paper, like the newspaper. Mary had to see for herself, so she went to Mount Vernon. Yes, George was safe, and thank goodness he was through with the army. So that was that, Mary thought. Now George would stay put. She asked him for some money and went home. But that was not that. 2 years later, an English general arrived in Virginia. He was going after those French again, and he asked George to come along. At the last minute, Mary heard about it. She jumped on her horse and rode to Mount Vernon. Mary flung herself into the house, and there was George, ready to go. Mary lit into him. That means she started arguing with him. George listened. He was polite. But she knew that look on his face, his stubborn look. What could Mary do? She was his mother, but now George was a grown man, and he had a mind of his own. She stamped out of the house and rode home. So there she is dashing on her horse to Mount Vernon, and here she is arguing with George, and then she's finally giving up and going home. George went off, and Mary tried to get along, but she ran out of things. Once she ran out of butter. And where was George? Off meddling. She wrote him a letter. Please send some butter, she said. Butter? Here George was about to go into battle. No one had enough food or water. Many of the men were sick, and his mother wanted butter? He wrote to her. There was no butter where he was. Goodness gracious. There he is. Oh, he's thinking, ay, 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 my mom's writing for butter? Oh. When the battle came, it was a bloody one. The English lost. More than half of them were killed or wounded. 2 of George's horses were shot. George returned to Mount Vernon, sick, tired, unhappy. Mary wrote to him. "Don't ever, ever go to war again," she begged. But how could George promise? How did he know what would happen? So there he is, sad and returning. And there he is in bed. And there's her letter. Then, on January 6, 1759, George married Martha Custis. Now he'd stayed put, Mary thought. She wrote to her brother Joseph. There had been no end to her troubles with George, she said, all those years in the army, but now he has given up. Her troubles were over. All of Mary's children were grown and moving away. Betty was married and lived in Fredericksburg, so Mary was alone on the farm. But she didn't mind. Like many country women, Mary liked to smoke a pipe, so sometimes she did. George wouldn't have approved, but George wasn't there, was he? And we've talked about how in the old days people didn't know that smoking was bad for you. So a lot of people smoked, in those days, pipes. Of course, George and Martha did come to see her. He'd look over the farm. Often it was in a mess. Mary did not run things well. George gave her money, and more money. It didn't help. She still felt poor. Mary was 60 years old in 1768. The farm was a lonely place to live. George told her she should move to Fredericksburg, near Betty. So George is trying to encourage his mother to move closer to his sister. Mary had never heard such foolishness. Drink Fredericksburg water? Leave her well? Dress up every day? Not on your life. George argued with his mother, but Mary would not hear of it. Then, in 1772, George bought a house in Fredericksburg for his mother, next door to Betty. George said he would pay a man to run Ferry Farm, and this man would send Mary food from the farm, chickens and eggs too. Mary didn't give in right away. But suppose she did give in. Someone could bring her water from her well. She could dig up the plants from her kitchen garden and take them with her to Fredericksburg. So Mary moved across the river, and there she is in the rowboat with her plants. And it sounds like she's going to have them send water from the farm. Okay. She's a little picky. She planted a garden at her new house. Mint, sweet peas, rosemary, daisies. She made gingerbread for the children of the neighborhood. There she is gardening. Oh, there's a cute little cat on the wheelbarrow. And she's serving out some gingerbread. Wow, this is making me hungry to make some gingerbread. It's kind of a cold day. It must be nice for baking. And often, Mary walked over to Betty's to visit. Betty still looked exactly like George. Sometimes the children would beg her to imitate him. Imitate is when you act like somebody else, like copy them. She would put on a cape and a man's three-cornered hat. They wore those kinds of hats in those days. She'd take her husband's sword, so her husband was in the military. Then she'd tell everyone to stand at attention, and everyone would. They might even salute. They had good times together. So they're all kind of playing, and there's George's sister, Betty, dressed up, ordering everyone around. Sometimes Mary liked to be alone. She would go behind Betty's house and sit on a large, flat rock there. She loved that rock. It was her special place. She would listen to the quiet and forget her troubles. She didn't even worry about George. But trouble was on the way. People in the colonies were fussing. What was the King of England doing to them? Taxing them, taking away their rights. Mary didn't go along with that talk. Her brother, Joseph, was loyal to the king. So she was too. Of course, George had to be in the middle of the fuss, meddling again, drilling troops in Virginia, getting ready to fight the king. Maybe the colonies would even break away from England. Maybe they would try to rule themselves. Well, there she's peacefully on her rock. But there is George drilling some troops. Do you know what's coming? On April 19th, 1775, Americans fought their first battle against the English. George was made the top general of the army. Mary was not surprised, but the king was not going to like that, Mary said. She knew what would happen. One day the king would hang George. And right away she felt poor. Oh no, there she's imagining the worst. In her think bubble, George has gotten in trouble, and there's the king. George went from battle to battle. Mary read about him in the paper. He was in Boston, in New York, in New Jersey. But what did the paper know? She liked first-hand news, but she didn't get much news from George. The war went on, and Mary felt poorer and poorer. She grumbled about hard times. She even asked neighbors for money. Once she wrote to her son John, "I never lived so poor in my life," she said. Once she wrote to the people in the Virginia government. She was the mother of George Washington, she said, and she was in want. That means she needed something. Could they give her an allowance? George heard about this, and he put a stop to it. He wrote to the people in Virginia. His mother was not in want. Her children would never let her be in want. George asked his brother John to talk to her. Her wants were all in her mind, George said, and endless. She must stop taking money from friends. The war finally ended. America had won. Now it was going to rule itself. After the last battle, George went to Fredericksburg, and soon he was back at Mount Vernon. Mary was 75 years old now, and she was not, well, that was pretty old for those days, right? Why didn't she move in with one of her children? George asked. But not with him. She wouldn't like Mount Vernon. He had so much company, important company. She would have to dress up all the time. Mary didn't want to move anywhere. She would just stay put, she said. Oh, there's George sitting at her bedside, and the speech bubble says, please, and she says, no. At home, Mary didn't dress up, not even for George's important friends. Once, a famous French general came to visit. She had on her black cotton gardening dress, but she didn't care. She served him a mint drink and gingerbread. They had a nice visit. In February 1789, George Washington was elected President of the United States. Mary was not surprised. Who else would they choose? There she's offering gingerbread to the French visitor, and there's George becoming president, being sworn in. In August, Mary Ball Washington died. She was 81 years old. That's really old for the old days. She was buried just where she wanted to be buried, beside her quiet rock. The whole country made a fuss over her. All the men in the president's house wore black badges on their hats, because black is a color that's a symbol for mourning, for sadness after someone dies. They tied black ribbons on their swords. They wore black bands on their arms, and there were no parties for a week. The papers printed fancy words about Mary. She wouldn't have believed them, but they did call her the president's mother, and she was that. So I hope you enjoyed that story, that true story about George Washington's mother. I'm making connections. I remember that in some of the other books it explained that his mom was a little hard to get along with. But sometimes I wonder, and I've read some more about this in a biography, a grown-up biography I'm reading about Washington, that sometimes in the old days they might have written that someone like Mary Washington was a little hard to get along with, but it was really just that she was a strong woman who had her own mind and was willing to let people know what she wanted and what her concerns were. And of course, in the old days, as we've talked about so many times, people had different ideas about how men and women should behave, and women who were strong and said what they thought were sometimes not thought so well of, or people would complain about that. Anyway, also, if you're interested, Jean Fritz, who's a great writer, has written all kinds of other books and some other fun history books like this about different famous Americans. So I hope you have a nice afternoon. Try to get outside, but it's chilly. I'm wearing my vest still. Be sure to keep washing your hands, cover your coughs and sneezes, do some reading and some writing, help your family around the house, and stay healthy. I love you guys. I miss you. Elbow bump.